Here's the thing, Dan. You're wrong on this topic, just like you have been wrong in many of your previous videos.
All right, let's see it.
The only thing that you accomplished in that video was you brought up different translations that agreed with your interpretation of that verse.
No, that's not true. I also pointed out that this is the overwhelming academic consensus, and I pointed out even the resources that you were using to try to argue against the consensus reading agreed with the consensus reading. And I didn't provide any further argument because I already pointed out all of the reasons that this definitely refers to sexual assault in the first video. You did not respond to that reasoning, so I don't feel the need to repeat myself.
The Septuagint is a great tool, especially for studying the New Testament. However, there are many differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew Bible in every book of the Old Testament, and some of these differences are significant.
See, I'm well aware of this. In fact, that was the precise topic of the master's thesis that I wrote at the University of Oxford, and for which I won an award for Best Dissertation from the University of Oxford. But if you want to make the case that the Septuagint's rendering of a given passage diverges from its Hebrew source text, either because of translator exegesis or because of a variant source text, you actually have to make the case. The mere fact that there can be differences is not evidence that there is a difference in a given passage. You actually have to make that case, and you have done absolutely no such thing whatsoever.
So bringing up these different translations that agree with your interpretation does not validate your argument in any way, especially if you cannot connect that to the original context of the scripture.
See, I explained the context very clearly in the original video, and you never responded to the details of that explanation.
You admit that Taufaz has different interpretations, and then you proceed to declare that your interpretation is the most correct just because you have these other translations that agree with you.
No, what I did was explain that when you actually learn Hebrew, which you very clearly have not done, you learn the ways the contextual and morphological and other cues point in the direction of the best reading. And then I showed that this is the best reading and that the overwhelming majority of the scholarship agrees.
I've already provided in several videos an analysis of the context in Deuteronomy 22 verse 28, as well as provided you with other verses where Taufaz is used, but it has a different application.
No, what you did was selectively and naively highlight a few pieces of the context and then just arbitrarily assert that that makes your reading correct. You also entirely ignored my more detailed explanation of the context.
Taufaz is never used in the Bible to describe rape.
That is entirely inaccurate, and that is a circular argument. The overwhelming academic consensus is that it very clearly describes it in this passage.
The word that is used is kauzak, which I also mentioned in previous videos.
You continue to mispronounce these roots based on your misunderstanding of a 19th century transliteration convention. The word is chazak.
You look at the scripture from 2 Samuel, you see that Amnon forced Tamar and lay with her. The word used for forced is kauzak.
No, it's not. The verb chazak occurs in verse 11 of this chapter, and in your translation it is the verb that is rendered he took hold of. The verb that is rendered force in verse 12 here is the verbal root ana, and specifically the PL stem of that verbal root, which can mean to oppress or to rape a woman, as it does here multiple times, as it does in Genesis 34, as it does in Judges 19. Oh yeah, the PL of ana is also used in Deuteronomy 22:29 to describe what the man does to this unfortunate young woman.
There are many competent authorities in biblical interpretation who disagree with you, such as Charles Foster Kent, a Yale professor, and J.A. Thompson, an Old Testament scholar and biblical archaeologist, and Meredith Klein, another Old Testament scholar.
So these are all dead scholars. One of them died 98 years ago, but I decided to look up their positions on this. So the only relevant thing I could find from Charles Foster Kent, the scholar who died 98 years ago, was a 1907 book called Israel's Laws and Traditional Precedents, which is really just kind of categorizing the different passages. So here we have, under the category of laws of divorce, Deuteronomy 22:28, which Kent renders, if a man findeth a young woman who is a virgin but is not betrothed, and lay hands on her, and lie with her, and they be found, etc., etc. So this rendering would seem to suggest that Kent agrees with my interpretation of the verb tafas. But if you can point me in the direction of some scholarship that explicitly disagrees with me, I'd appreciate that. Klein actually has a commentary on Deuteronomy, and I looked that up. And it actually doesn't say one way or another if this was forced or consensual. It just refers to the seduction of unmarried girls. And that word seduction is used to refer both to rape as well as to consensual intercourse. So Klein at least does not make clear whether or not he agrees with me. Again, if you can point me in the direction of scholarship that is explicit about whether or not the scholar agrees, I'd appreciate that. And Thompson also has a commentary on Deuteronomy, but as with Klein, they use the word seduction to refer to both forced as well as consensual intercourse, and they do not distinguish. So again, if you can point me in the direction of a place where Thompson explicitly describes disagreeing with me, that would be wonderful. For the time being, I can't find any indication at all that any of these scholars actually disagrees with my reading.
You do not have conclusive non-contradicting evidence to suggest that verse 28 is talking about rape.
So I already presented that evidence in the first video, which you entirely ignored. I have also repeatedly shown that you do not know the language, you do not know the literature, you don't even know the scholarship.
You can go ahead and respond with 50 different translations if you want, but it's very clear when you study the context, verse 28 is not talking about rape. Just like some of your previous work, you have got it wrong on this topic. But you choose to maintain these views and beliefs because you want to hold firm to your foundation that the Bible was written for men by men. Your attempts at discrediting people by showcasing your knowledge of the history falls apart when you prove that you can't even understand basic context. Education is a great thing. I'm not against that in any way. But keep in mind, when Jesus came around, it was the religious scholars and the most learned members in society that misunderstood him the most.
So all you've done is repeatedly assert that you've provided the correct context, even though all you've done is just repeatedly assert a context. You've ignored the context that I've provided, and you have repeatedly demonstrated that you don't know the first thing about Hebrew language or literature.